We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Dr. Bart Ehrman, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing well, thanks. Classes have ended, so life's good.
That's always good. You are the James A. Gray Distinguished Professor at UNC Chapel Hill. You've written countless books. Literally, your newest one coming out is on the Book of Revelation. But I love your work. Your work's on Audible. You've educated probably millions of people across the world. And I just want to say thank you for what you do.
Thank you. Thank you for that. You can count the books. They're not that many.
Well, I got to pretend, There are plenty, and you're still writing, and there's always something to learn and keep learning. So thank you for joining us again here at MythVision. I have a very good friend who wants to remain anonymous that helped me in the questions and making this video possible. So I want to say thank you to my secret Batman. You are awesome. So Dr. Ehrman, let's start with the first question and we'll just dive in because I feel like what we're going to be doing today is testing your PhD skills again.
Wow. Okay, bring it on.
I know, right? Like you look forward to every one of these. So I'll read the question and we'll go from there. Okay. Since there are no major manuscripts of the New Testament books that are dated earlier than about the 3rd century, how can scholars be certain that what they have represents what was written in the original autographs? It would have been possible during the interval to insert edits or change passages to reflect changing theological views of the leaders without later scholars knowing. It is known, for example, that Marcion during the 140s came out with an edited version of Luke. The earliest complete manuscripts do not contain the longer version of Mark 16 and John's story of the woman taken in adultery, suggesting this editing process continued into at least the mid-300s and beyond. That's the question.
Yeah, well, okay, we could spend an hour on this one. It's a complicated question. If you're asking how can we be certain, if you mean absolutely certain beyond a measure of a doubt, the answer is no. We can't be absolutely certain beyond a measure of the doubt. We do have many, many more manuscripts of the New Testament than for any other book from the ancient world. That's not strange because most of our manuscripts come from the Middle Ages, and in Europe in the Middle Ages, the people copying book were Christian monks, and they're more likely to copy the writings of Paul than the plays of Plautus. They're just not going to copy. Not that interested in Plautus, frankly, and so we have more manuscripts, and so that part's good. But you're right, we don't have manuscripts. We start having little fragmentary manuscripts in the 2nd Christian century. So the earliest one may be as early as 30 or 40 years after the original of John. It's just a little fragment, a piece of a size of a credit card. We don't start getting sizable fragments till around the year 200. Around 200, we start getting, we've got a manuscript of some of the Gospels that are, for example, that are fragmentary. They're missing pages, but they're there. And then we don't get complete manuscripts until the 4th century. And so the question is, we can tell pretty well how the text got copied after that because we have lots of manuscripts. But how do we know that it was copied accurately prior to that? And we don't know for certain, but there are pretty good levels of probability that we basically know what these authors wrote. And the scholarship that's devoted to this is the technical term is textual criticism. It's a term that many people misunderstand. People think that textual criticism means like interpretation of the text, and it doesn't mean that. It does not mean that. It's a field. It's a term that's used in every field of literary studies. It's in Shakespeare or Chaucer or Plato or whatever, where you try to reconstruct what the author wrote based on their surviving manuscripts. So every field has this. Prior to the invention of printing, all you had were handwritten copies. So the deal is, the reason that you can be reasonably sure that you're pretty close is because suppose in the year 400. You start getting manuscripts. By the year 500, you say you get 100 manuscripts in the year 500. Well, those manuscripts didn't appear out of nowhere in the year 500. They were copies of manuscripts made earlier, and those manuscripts were made from copies made earlier and earlier until you get back to the originals. If you get to the year 500 and say you've got say you got 200 I don't know what you got. You don't have 200 manuscripts, but suppose you did have 200 manuscripts. Those manuscripts are not all copied from the same copy. They're copied from different copies, which were copied from different copies, which were copied from different copies. So the chances that a change was made in, say, the year 150, before we had manuscripts, that affected every surviving copy would be it'd be kind of strange. It could have happened. But you see what I mean? Because like in the year 150, you'd have a number of copies. You might have like 1,000 copies out there or something. And those copies we don't have, but we have the copies of the copies of the copies that go back to those copies. And they're all independent lines of transmission. Am I talking sensible English here?
No, you are. The difficulty is how complex this is for the layman. And
I'm trying to talk in a way that
right.
you can get for a layperson, because if you get, so if somebody, when Paul wrote his letter to the Romans,
right?
Suppose the first person to make a copy of that made a huge change, like added 5 verses, okay? Right. And that the original got lost, but that copy that added 5 verses was the one that everybody then copied. So if that happened, then we'd have no way of knowing whether those 5 verses came back to Paul or the guy who copied it.
Right.
But the chances of that happening become more and more remote as time passes on, because these manuscripts are all being traced through different genealogical lines. And so really the reality is, I mean, scholars study this. I mean, this is, I devoted about 20 years to trying to work through all these issues. And so it's hard stuff. And you've got to know the ancient languages and all that. But the chances are pretty good that when you're reading Mark, you're basically reading what Mark said, but you can't be sure. The reason it matters you can't be sure is because fundamentalists want to insist they have the very words from God. Right. They're like, well, if you want to insist that, you're kind of in trouble here, because there's no way you can know that.
So let me ask you this to get down into a little more of a detail here in particular. We start seeing, do the church fathers play a significant role in how we evaluate the textual tradition? Because, for example, and I'm talking about from critical scholars, not from like the tradition of church, because let's say I said, okay, how do we know that they didn't invent most of this writing, and the theology that we're looking at isn't maybe early 2nd century? And because there's such friction between certain Christian groups, like what we see with Marcion coming up, or the Valentinians, or whoever it might be, there's all this wild west happening in the 2nd century. How do we know that these manuscripts aren't actually being developed then, and that's when these narratives are playing their role? I mean, are you using internal evidence within the text themselves to say these are placed in the 40s, 50s, for example, with Paul letters, or are we also combining church fathers and the text themselves internally to try and date them?
So it's a related question, but there are two big issues going on. One is, how far back can we trace what the authors wrote? How can we get back to what they said? Are we copying something they said, or something that some 2nd century scribe said they said? There's that. There's also the question, when did they actually write this thing?
Right.
How do you know that Paul was writing in the 50s if you don't have manuscripts until later? They're related, but they're different methodologies that one uses to establish those two things, and they're very firmly established methodologies that are a little bit hard to explain to somebody who's not an abnormal scholar doing this. But the church fathers are important for this. My PhD research, my dissertation, was actually dealing with this problem of church fathers quoting the New Testament, and the issue is that you have church fathers living in different parts of the world, say in the 2nd century. So you've got a church father living in Rome, and somebody living in Gaul, France, and somebody living in, say, Palestine, and somebody living in Egypt, and they're all quoting the text. Say they're quoting the Gospel of John. If these different church fathers in different places are quoting John, and they're quoting it the same way, that shows that John was circulating in basically the same form throughout the world, which means it was not invented in any one of those places in the 2nd century, because it had already been spread. And so what you do, one of the things you have to do, is you have to study how the church fathers quote the New Testament, because in theory, if you can establish with confidence what the church fathers quoted, then you know what their manuscripts looked like. And so my PhD dissertation was on the writings of a 4th century church father named Didymus the Blind, who was from Alexandria, Egypt. And I analyzed all of his quotations of the Gospels in detail. I mean, I extracted all of them in Greek, and I compared them to a couple of dozen Greek and Latin manuscripts we have from the ages to see which manuscripts he was most closely aligned with, to establish what the manuscripts looked like in 4th century Alexandria. The ones he had access to. And what you do is you do that for church father after church father after church father, and you and that helps you then know more about how things are being quoted and circulated in periods when we don't have a lot of manuscripts. And so there's stuff like that scholars do that most people have never heard of. But we are on this problem. Let me tell you, this is what we do. And so so based on all of that, it's really, when you're reading the Gospel of Mark today, you can't know that the verse was originally worded just like this, but you can be pretty confident it was pretty close to that, with some things that got changed, and some places where you don't know what it said. Scholars disagreed. Did it mean say this or did it say that? They did, but we know those places, and so it will be really amazing if in 100 years we have like a different understanding of any of this. It's possible, but I mean, it would be pretty amazing.